She was 20 years old and had nothing left but a canvas rucksack, a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and $2 silver pressed flat against the lining of her coat pocket. No family, no address, no plan that extended past the next meal. And with those $2, she bought a forgotten plantation house on the edge of the Shenandoah Valley that had not seen a living soul in 11 years. But what nobody knew, what she herself would not discover for weeks, was that beneath the crumbling hearthstone of the main fireplace, someone had buried something meant to be found, and what was written on the paper wrapped around it would change the entire course of her life. If you're new here, subscribe and follow along, because this story is worth hearing all the way through. Her name was Eliza Kane, and she was born in the winter of 1851 in a narrow clapboard house on the outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia, the third of 5 children and the only girl. Her father, Thomas Kane, was a farrier by trade, a man who shod horses for the plantations that spread across Albemarle County like green quilts stitched together by stone walls and creek beds. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one, and the farmers trusted him because he never overcharged and never left a shoe loose. Her mother, Catherine, had been a seamstress before her marriage and continued to take in mending after it, and the house always smelled of hot iron and damp wool and the particular sweetness of thread wax. Eliza grew up in a household where work was the grammar of love. You did not say you cared for someone. You mended their coat. You sharpened their blade. You rose before dawn to stoke the fire so the house would be warm when they woke. Her brothers, Samuel, James, Peter, and the youngest, Henry, were loud and physical boys who wrestled in the yard and broke things and were forgiven for it. And Eliza learned early that the rules that applied to her were different, quieter, and more exacting. She was expected to cook, to clean, to sew, to keep the ledger of household expenses in a hand so neat it could have been typeset. She did all of these things well, and she did them without complaint. And the fact that she also wanted to learn her father's trade, wanted to understand the geometry of a hoof, the temper of iron, the way a well-set nail could hold for months through mud and stone, was treated as an eccentricity that would pass. It did not pass. When she was 12, her father began letting her work the bellows in his shop, and by 14 she could draw a shoe to shape on the anvil, and by 16 she could trim and fit a hoof with a confidence that made her brothers, who had no interest in the work, look away in something between admiration and unease. Thomas Kane did not praise her often, but he let her stand beside him, and in their family that was the highest form of recognition. He gave her his farrier's rasp when she turned 17, a tool with a hickory handle worn smooth by 30 years of his grip, and told her it was the most honest tool he owned, because it could only take away what was not needed. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth in her rucksack from that day forward, and she never used it without thinking of his hands. Thomas Kane died in the autumn of 1867, thrown from a horse he was shoeing for a man named Garrett, who had not warned him the animal was greenbroke. He struck his head on the corner of a water trough and did not wake up. Eliza was 16. Her mother, who had always been thin and precise and quietly fierce, became something else after that. Not broken exactly, but rearranged, as though the loss had shifted the furniture of her personality, and she could no longer find her way through familiar rooms. Within a year, Catherine Kane married a man named Horace Pemberton, a dry goods merchant from Richmond, who had come to Charlottesville to open a store, and who saw in Catherine a woman who could keep his books and manage his household, and ask very little in return. Horace was not cruel in any way that left marks. He was simply a man who had purchased a life and expected it to function according to his specifications. He was 43, with a soft belly and hard opinions, and a way of speaking to Eliza's brothers that made them feel small, and a way of not speaking to Eliza at all that made her feel invisible. He did not like that she worked with tools. He did not like that she smelled of iron and hoof oil. He did not like that she read books he had not approved, or that she walked alone to her father's old shop, which still stood empty at the edge of town, and sat inside it with the door closed. He told Catherine that the girl needed direction, and Catherine, who was tired and afraid and no longer sure of her own judgment, agreed. Eliza's brothers left one by one, Samuel to work on the railroad, James to a logging camp in West Virginia, Peter to the merchant marine, and Henry, the youngest and the one Eliza loved most fiercely, to an apprenticeship with a carpenter in Staunton. Each departure was a small amputation. By the time Eliza was 19, it was just her and her mother and Horace in the house that no longer smelled of thread wax and iron, but of Horace's pipe tobacco and the particular staleness of a home where no one laughs. The woman who shaped Eliza most deeply, apart from her father, was not her mother, but a woman named Mabel Thorne, who lived alone in a stone cottage 2 miles outside Charlottesville, and who had been, at various points in her life, a midwife, a tanner, a beekeeper, and a teacher of reading to anyone who wanted to learn. Mabel was 68 when Eliza first knocked on her door at the age of 13, carrying a book she had found in her father's shop and could not make sense of, a manual on veterinary farriery published in Philadelphia. Mabel read the first chapter aloud to her, explained the diagrams, and then said, "Come back Tuesday and bring your own pencil." Eliza came back every Tuesday for 6 years. Mabel taught her to read not just words but structures, how a house was framed, how a stone wall was laid, how a chimney drew, how soil told you what it could grow by its color and texture and smell. She taught her to make soap and candles, and to tan a rabbit hide, and to set a broken bone in a splint of willow bark and cotton strips. She taught her to keep bees and to read weather and to build a fire that would burn all night on 2 logs if you placed them correctly. Mabel had been widowed at 31 and had never remarried, and she told Eliza once while they were smoking a hive together in the late summer heat that the most important thing a woman could possess was not beauty or charm or even kindness, but competence. Because competence could not be taken away by anyone. Not by a husband, not by a father, not by God himself. Mabel died in the spring of 1870, quietly, in her sleep, with her boots still on and a cup of cold tea on the table beside her bed. She left Eliza her beekeeper's veil, her tanning knives, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with recipes, remedies, and observations about the natural world, written in a hand so small you needed good light to read it. Eliza carried that notebook in her rucksack beside her father's rasp, and together they formed the entirety of her inheritance. Not money, not land, not a name that opened doors, but knowledge made physical, tools that fit her hands, and the memory of 2 people who had seen her clearly and believed she was enough. The morning Eliza was cast out was a Tuesday in October of 1871, and the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the first rot of fallen apples in the orchard behind the house. She had been at Mabel's old cottage the day before, cleaning it out as she did every few months to keep the mice from nesting in the walls, and she had come home late, past the hour Horace considered acceptable for a woman to be walking alone. She had not argued with him. She had simply walked past him in the hallway and gone to her room, and she heard him speaking to her mother through the wall in a voice too low to make out the words, but too sharp to mistake the tone. In the morning, when she came downstairs, her rucksack was sitting on the front porch, packed with her clothes and her blanket, and her father's rasp and Mabel's notebook and nothing else. The front door was locked. A note had been pinned to the rucksack with a straight pin, written in Horace's careful merchant's hand on a piece of his store stationery. It read, "Eliza, it has been decided that you will make your own way from this point forward. Your mother agrees this is best. Do not return to this house. Enclosed are $2 for your immediate needs. H. Pemberton." The $2 were in a small envelope tucked inside the rucksack's front pocket. Eliza stood on the porch for a long time, holding the note, reading it twice, and then folding it into a square and placing it in her coat pocket beside the envelope. She did not knock on the door. She did not call her mother's name. She did not cry, though something behind her ribs felt like a door closing in a room she would never enter again. She looked at the house, the clapboard siding her father had painted white every third spring, the window box where her mother had once grown herbs, the chimney that leaned slightly to the east because the foundation had settled unevenly in the year she was born. And she picked up her rucksack, settled it on her shoulders, and walked down the porch steps and out through the gate and onto the road that led west. She was 20 years old. She had $2, a wool blanket, a farrier's rasp, a beekeeper's notebook, and the clothes she was wearing. She did not look back, not because she was brave, but because she understood, with the clarity that only loss can provide, that looking back would not change what was behind her and would only slow her progress toward whatever lay ahead. She walked west because the road went west, and because the mountains were there, and because she had read in Mabel's notebook, in an entry dated June of 1859, that the Shenandoah Valley was the most forgiving land in Virginia. Deep soil, clean water, mild winters by mountain standards, and a habit of absorbing people who had nowhere else to go. She walked for 3 days. The first night she slept in a hay barn beside the road outside Waynesboro, burrowed into loose hay with her blanket pulled over her head and the rucksack pressed against her chest, like a child holding a doll. The second night, she slept under a rock overhang above a creek whose name she did not know, and the water made a sound all night like someone turning pages in a book. And she lay awake listening to it and watching the stars through the gap in the trees above her and feeling, for the first time since her father died, something that was not grief or anger, but a strange, clean emptiness, as though she had been scraped out like a gourd and was waiting to be filled with something new. The third day she crossed the Blue Ridge through a gap where the road narrowed to a wagon's width and the trees pressed close on both sides, and when she came through to the other side, the valley opened below her like a green hand laid flat on the earth, and the light was different, softer, more golden, filtered through a haze that hung over the fields and the river and the distant line of the Alleghenies beyond. She stood at the top of the gap for a long time, breathing air that smelled of pine sap and river mud and the faint sweetness of late-season clover, and she felt the emptiness inside her shift and settle into something more like readiness. The road descended through switchbacks into a small town called Millbrook, which was not much more than a crossroads with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a church with a cedar-shake roof, and a scattering of houses set back from the road behind split-rail fences. The store was run by a man named Amos Kettle, who was 70 years old and had the particular patience of someone who had seen enough of the world to know that most of what happened in it was not worth getting excited about. Eliza bought a pound of cornmeal and a quarter-pound of salt with 15 cents from one of her silver dollars and asked if there was work in the valley for someone who could shoe horses and mend fences and keep bees. Amos Kettle looked at her for a long moment, at her boots, which were worn but well-oiled, and at her hands, which were calloused in the right places, and at her eyes, which were steady and did not look away. And he said, There might be. Depends on what you're willing to live in. She told him she was willing to live in anything that had a roof and 4 walls, and he nodded slowly and said there was a place up the valley, about 4 miles north along the creek road, that had been sitting empty since the war, and the county had been trying to sell it for years, and the last price he had heard was $2, which was not a price for a house but a price for the county to be rid of the paperwork. The place was called the Hargrove property, and it had been, before the war, a small plantation of about 40 acres that grew tobacco and corn and kept a modest orchard of apple and pear trees along the south-facing slope above the creek. The main house was not grand. It was no columned mansion of the kind that filled the imaginations of people who had never been to Virginia. But it was substantial, a 2-story structure built of local limestone and heavy oak timbers, with a central hall plan and 4 rooms on each floor and a detached kitchen connected to the main house by a covered breezeway. The roof was cedar shake, and fully a third of it had collapsed on the east side, letting 11 years of rain and snow and leaf fall into the upper rooms, which had rotted the floorboards and brought down a section of the ceiling into what had once been a parlor. The windows were gone, not broken but removed, taken by scavengers who could sell the glass, and the openings gaped like empty eye sockets in the pale limestone walls. The front door hung from one hinge, and the porch had buckled where a locust tree had grown up through the boards, splitting them apart with the patient, irresistible force of a living thing that did not know it was destroying something. The stone foundation was sound. Eliza walked the entire perimeter, pressing her hand against the walls, feeling for cracks, for settling, for the telltale bulge that meant a wall was leaning and would eventually fall. The limestone was solid, 2 feet thick at the base, laid in courses with lime mortar that had hardened over the decades into something nearly as strong as the stone itself. The chimney on the west end stood straight and true, a massive column of the same limestone, with a firebox wide enough to hold a 4-foot log and a hearthstone that was a single slab of blue-gray slate, cracked across one corner but otherwise intact. The east chimney had partially collapsed, and its stones lay in a heap inside what had been a bedroom. But the west chimney, the main chimney, the one that served the great room and the kitchen beyond, was as solid as the day it was built. Inside, the damage was worse than it appeared from outside, but it was damage of neglect, not of violence. The plaster walls had fallen away in sheets, exposing the lath beneath, which was hand-split oak and still sound where it had stayed dry. The staircase to the second floor was missing 4 treads, but the stringers were intact. Heavy oak planks notched into the wall, framing with mortise and tenon joints that had not moved in decades. The floors on the west side of the house, the dry side, sheltered by the intact portion of the roof, were dirty and stained but solid, wide planks of heart pine that had darkened to the color of molasses and still held their nails. The kitchen building was in better shape than the main house, being smaller and more tightly built, with a stone floor and a cooking fireplace with an iron crane still hanging in place, though the crane's hook was missing. The breezeway roof had fallen, but the posts still stood, and the framing could be rebuilt with straight poles and new shakes. The orchard was a wilderness of unpruned branches and suckers and wild grape, but Eliza could see beneath the tangle the shapes of trees that had been well planted and well spaced, and that still bore fruit. She found 3 apples on the ground beneath one tree, small and scarred, but sweet when she bit into them. The tobacco fields were gone to goldenrod and broom sedge, but the corn bottom along the creek still showed dark, rich soil where the water had deposited silt every spring for centuries. She walked the property for 2 hours, touching things, measuring with her eyes, cataloging what was ruined and what was waiting. She saw what other people would not have seen. that the bones of this place were good, that the stone was true, that the timber was old growth and would outlast anything cut in her lifetime, that the land wanted to grow things, and the water ran clean and cold and close. She went back to Amos Kettle's store that afternoon and told him she wanted to buy it. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but something in between, and he got out the county ledger and wrote up the transfer on a half-sheet of foolscap, and Eliza Kane pressed her $2 silver onto the counter. The $2 Horace Pemberton had enclosed in her eviction note, the sum total of her worth in his estimation, and she signed her name, and the Hargrove property was hers. She owned 40 acres of overgrown valley land, a limestone house with a broken roof, a detached kitchen, a ruined orchard, and a fireplace with a hearthstone she had not yet thought to look beneath. She had no money left. She had a rucksack, a blanket, a farrier's rasp, a beekeeper's notebook, and a house that most people in the valley considered not a house at all, but a monument to what the war had taken and what time had not bothered to give back. She carried her rucksack up the creek road in the late afternoon light, and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the valley floor like long blue fingers, and the air was cold enough that she could see her breath, and she walked through the broken front door of the Hargrove house and set her rucksack down on the heart pine floor of the great room and stood there in the silence, listening to the wind move through the empty window frames and the creak of the one remaining shutter and the distant sound of the creek running over stones. And she thought, "This is mine, not given, not inherited, not permitted, bought with the only money she had in the world, money that had been meant as a dismissal, as a final transaction between herself and the people who should have loved her, and she had turned it into something else entirely. Not a closing, but an opening. Not an ending, but the first page of a life she would write herself, in her own hand, on the walls of a house that had been forgotten by everyone except the land it stood on. She lived in the great room for the first week, sleeping on the heart pine floor with her blanket folded double beneath her and her rucksack as a pillow. And she spent the daylight hours clearing debris from the rooms she could save and stacking what she could not save in the yard for burning. She ate cornmeal mush cooked in a tin pot she found in the kitchen building, and she drank water from the creek carried in a clay jug that had been sitting on a shelf in the kitchen for 11 years with a skin of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. On the 9th day, she turned her attention to the west fireplace. It drew well. She had been burning small fires in it every evening to take the chill off the great room, but the hearthstone troubled her. The crack she had noticed on her first visit ran diagonally across the slab from the right front corner to a point about 2/3 of the way back, and the smaller piece created by this crack had settled slightly, perhaps half an inch lower than the larger piece, which meant either the support beneath it had given way or there was a void underneath. She knelt on the stone and pressed her palms flat against it and felt the smaller section shift under her weight, just barely. A movement so slight it was more sensation than observation. She got her father's rasp from her rucksack and used the flat end to scrape the mortar from the joint between the two pieces of slate, working carefully, the way Thomas Kane had taught her to work. Not forcing the tool, but letting it find the line of least resistance. The mortar was old andite and came away in dry powder. When the joint was clean, she worked the rasp's edge under the smaller piece and levered it upward, and it came free more easily than she expected, because it had been lifted before. Beneath the slab was not packed earth or rubble fill, which is what she would have expected beneath a hearthstone laid on a proper foundation. Instead, there was a cavity, a rectangular space about 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 8 inches deep. lined on all four sides with flat stones set on edge and covered on the bottom with a piece of oilcloth that had been folded carefully and pressed into the space with the deliberateness of someone who intended what they placed here to last. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The oilcloth was dark with age but intact, and when she lifted it out, she could feel the weight of something inside. Not heavy, but substantial, the weight of a book or a small box. She carried it to the window where the light was strongest and unfolded it on the floor. Inside the oilcloth were three things. The first was a leather pouch, soft and darkened with handling, drawn shut with a cord. The second was a small wooden box, about the size of a man's hand, made of walnut and joined at the corners with dovetails so precise they looked machine-cut, but were not. The third was a letter, folded into thirds and sealed with a drop of candle wax that had yellowed, but not cracked. She opened the leather pouch first. Inside were coins. Not silver dollars, but gold pieces, double eagles, $20 gold coins with Liberty on one side and an eagle on the other. She counted them twice. There were 14. $280 in gold, which was more money than her father had earned in 2 years of shoeing horses. More money than Horace Pemberton kept in his store safe on any given Saturday. More money than Eliza had ever held in her hands or expected to hold. She set the coins on the oilcloth in 2 neat rows and opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a piece of cotton batting that had yellowed to the color of old cream, was a woman's brooch, a small oval of carved ivory set in a silver frame, and the carving was a profile of a young woman with her hair swept up and a high collar at her throat, and the work was so fine that Eliza could see the individual strands of hair and the slight curve of the woman's smile. It was the kind of object that is not valuable by the standards of auction houses, but is priceless by the standards of the human heart. A thing made with love, carried with love, hidden with love. She held it in her palm and felt the warmth of it, the smoothness of the ivory, and she set it down gently beside the coins and picked up the letter. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the paper, which was heavy stock, the kind used for legal documents, and the handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. And she read it in the quiet of the great room with the afternoon light falling through the empty window frame and the sound of the creek in the distance. The letter read, "My name is Adelaide Hargrove, and I am writing this on the 14th of March, 1862, in the house my husband James and I built together in the year 1839. I am 61 years old. James has been dead for 3 years, and our son William was killed at Manassas last July, and I am alone now in this house which was built for a family and which has become very quiet. I do not know how much longer I will stay. The war is coming closer, and there are soldiers on the road every week, and I have heard that they are taking what they find in the houses they pass through. And so I am putting away what I have left of value in a place where it will not be found by men who are looking for things to take. The coins in this pouch are the savings of 23 years. James and I put aside what we could, a little each season after the tobacco was sold and the debts were paid, and it was never much in any single year, but it accumulated the way water accumulates in a cistern, slowly and without drama, and it became something substantial. I had intended it for William. I had intended many things for William. The brooch was carved by James in the winter of 1840, the first winter after we were married, when the snow was deep and there was nothing to do but sit by this fire and work with his hands. He carved it from a piece of ivory he had traded for in Staunton, and he said it was my likeness, though I told him he had made me prettier than I was, and he said he had made me exactly as I was. and that I was the one who could not see it. I have worn it every day since, and I am taking it off now for the first time in 22 years, and putting it in this box, and putting the box in this hole in the ground. And I will tell you that my hand does not want to let it go. But I would rather it be hidden and safe than taken by a stranger who does not know what it means. To whoever finds this, I do not know who you are or when you will come, or what will have brought you to this house. But if you are here, then you have need of shelter, and if you have lifted this stone, then perhaps you have need of what is beneath it. Take it. Take all of it. Use the money to mend what is broken, and plant what has gone fallow, and make this house a living place again. That is all I ask. That someone live here. That someone light a fire in this fireplace, and cook a meal in that kitchen, and walk through that orchard in the spring when the pear trees bloom. James and I were happy here. It was a good house and good land, and it deserved better than to be left empty. I hope you will be happy here too. I hope you will find what you need. Adelaide Hargrove, written in her own hand, in the house her husband built, on a cold night in March, with the fire burning low. Eliza read the letter twice, and then a third time. And on the third reading, her vision blurred, and she set the letter down on her knee and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat very still for a long time. She did not cry the way people cry in stories, dramatically, with sobs and shaking shoulders. She cried the way people cry when something they did not know they were carrying is finally set down. Quietly, with relief, with a gratitude so large it has no words, only weight. She did not spend the gold all at once. She was not a woman who had ever had money, and she understood instinctively that the value of money lay not in what it could buy in a single day, but in what it could sustain over months and years. She went to Amos Kettle's store the next morning and bought 20 pounds of cornmeal, 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt, a pound of coffee, a box of nails, a coil of rope, a pane of window glass, and a bar of lye soap, and she paid for it with 1 gold coin and received her change in silver and paper, and felt the strange vertigo of being a person who could buy things without calculating whether the purchase would mean going hungry. She told Amos about the house, not about the gold, not about the letter, just about the work that needed doing. And he listened with his hands folded on the counter, and then said there was a man named Cyrus Bell who lived about 2 miles south of Millbrook, who had been a carpenter before the war, and who still did work when his back allowed it, and that she might talk to him about the roof. Cyrus Bell was 64 years old, with a white beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and hands that were enormous and gentle and scarred across every knuckle. He came to the Hargrove property on a Wednesday morning, walked through the house without speaking, climbed a ladder to the roof line, came back down, and said, "Cedar shake. I can get you cedar from the Dawson mill. Take about 400 board feet for the east side. I'll need a helper." She told him she would be the helper. He looked at her the way Amos Kettle had looked at her, that expression between pity and admiration. And then he nodded and said, "We start Monday." They started Monday. Cyrus showed her how to strip the old shakes, working from the ridge down, prying each one loose with a flat bar and letting it slide down the roof slope into a pile on the ground. He showed her how to lay new shakes in staggered courses with a 2-inch overlap, nailing each one with 2 galvanized nails set an inch from the edge, and how to cut the shakes at the ridge line so they interlocked like fingers and shed water in both directions. They worked for 11 days on the roof, and during those 11 days, Eliza learned things about Cyrus Bell, that he had lost his wife to typhoid in 1858 and his only daughter to diphtheria in 1863, and that he had built 17 houses in the valley before the war, and had not built a single one after it, and that he kept a daguerreotype of his daughter in a tin case in his shirt pocket, and touched it sometimes without seeming to know he was doing it. On the fourth day, a woman named Ruth Jessup appeared at the property with a pot of bean soup and a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. Ruth was 52, the wife of a hay farmer named Edgar Jessup, and she had a face that looked like it had been designed specifically for the purpose of feeding people, broad and warm and incapable of concealing either concern or satisfaction. She set the pot on the kitchen hearth and said, "Cyrus told me there was a girl up here fixing the Hargrove place. I thought you might be hungry." She did not wait for thanks. She came back 2 days later with a crock of butter and a jar of pickled beets, and the day after that she brought her husband Edgar, who was 60 and built like a fence post, tall, thin, weathered, and absolutely vertical. And Edgar looked at the porch where the locust tree had grown through the boards and said, "I can pull that out with my team if you want. Take about an hour." He pulled it out in 40 minutes. The hole it left was 2 feet across, and Eliza filled it with new boards that Cyrus helped her cut and fit, and when it was done, the porch looked like a garment that had been patched by someone who cared more about function than appearance. Which is to say, it looked like it was loved. A man named Solomon Pratt, who was 38 and operated the grist mill on the creek a mile south of the property, brought her a sack of ground corn and a sack of wheat flour and refused payment and said only, "Adelaide Hargrove gave my mother flour when we had nothing. Consider it returned." A woman named Della Sims, who was 45 and kept goats on a hillside farm above Millbrook, brought her a nanny goat that was fresh in milk and said she had more goats than she needed, and that the animal's name was Patience, which Eliza thought was either a name or an instruction. Each person who came brought something specific and left without ceremony, and Eliza began to understand that this was how community worked in the valley. Not through declarations or meetings or organized charity, but through the steady accumulation of small practical acts, each one a sentence in a conversation that had been going on for generations. The weeks became months. Eliza repaired the staircase, cutting new treads from oak planks that Cyrus helped her mill from a tree that had fallen across the creek road in a November storm. She reglazed 4 windows with glass she bought from a supplier in Staunton, setting each pane in putty she made from linseed oil and chalk dust, the way Mabel Thorne had taught her. She rebuilt the breezeway between the main house and the kitchen, setting new locust posts in holes she dug herself and framing the roof with poplar poles and covering it with shakes left over from the main roof repair. She cleaned the cooking fireplace and found the missing crane hook in a pile of debris in the corner of the kitchen, rusted but sound. And she heated it in a fire she built in the yard and hammered it straight on a flat stone and rehung it on the crane and boiled water on it that evening and drank tea made from dried mint she had found growing wild along the creek bank. She pruned the orchard over the course of 3 weeks in December, working methodically from tree to tree, cutting away dead wood and suckers and crossing branches with a saw she borrowed from Cyrus and her father's rasp, which she used to smooth the cuts so they would heal cleanly. She found 23 apple trees, 11 pear trees, and 4 cherry trees, and of these, 31 were alive and capable of bearing fruit, and she stood among them on a cold December afternoon with wood chips in her hair and sap on her hands, and felt the particular satisfaction of having revealed something beautiful that had been hidden beneath neglect. She cleared a 1/4 acre of the creek bottom and turned the soil with a mattock she bought in Staunton, and planted winter rye as a cover crop, and in the spring she would plant corn and beans and squash in the dark river-bottom soil that Adelaide Hargrove's letter had asked her to bring back to life. She set up 2 beehives in the orchard using boxes she built from scrap lumber and baited with honeycomb she found in a hollow sycamore along the creek. And she tended them wearing Mabel Thorne's veil, which still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender and the particular dusty sweetness of an old woman's house. By January, the house was weather-tight. By February, it was warm. By March, the pear trees were blooming, just as Adelaide had said they would, and the blossoms were white and fragile and so thick on the branches that from a distance the orchard looked like it was covered in snow, and Eliza stood on the porch she had repaired and looked at them and thought of a woman she had never met who had loved this place enough to write a letter to a stranger and ask them to make it live again. Spring came to the valley the way spring comes to mountain places. Not all at once, but in stages, like a person waking slowly from a long sleep. First, the creek rose with snowmelt and ran fast and brown and loud over the stones. Then the willows along the bank turned yellow-green at their tips. Then the redbuds bloomed on the hillsides, and the dogwoods and the wild azaleas in the understory of the woods above the orchard, and the air filled with the sound of returning birds and the smell of warming earth and the particular electric sweetness of a world that has been dormant and is no longer. Eliza planted her garden in April, corn and pole beans and summer squash and tomatoes and peppers and herbs, and she planted it in rows as straight as sentences, and she watered it from the creek with buckets she carried on a yoke she carved from a piece of ash, and she watched it grow with the attention of someone who understands that a garden is not a thing you make, but a conversation you have with the soil and the rain and the sun, and that your part in the conversation is mostly listening. The goat Patience gave milk every morning and evening, and Eliza learned to make cheese from Ruth Jessup, who came to the property every Thursday now with something: a jar of preserves, a bundle of onion sets, a length of cloth, a piece of advice delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, regardless of whether it concerned the proper time to plant potatoes or the proper way to grieve a father. People in Millbrook knew her name now. Amos Kettle called her Miss Kane and kept a running account for her at the store that she paid monthly. Solomon Pratt ground her corn without charge and said it was still part of the flour debt his family owed the Hargroves. Della Sims brought a second goat, a kid this time, and said Patience needed company. Cyrus Bell came by every week or so, not to work, but to sit on the porch and drink coffee and look at the orchard and say very little, which was his way of saying he was glad the house was alive again. Eliza began shoeing horses for the valley's farmers, working out of a small forge she built against the south wall of the kitchen building, using stones from the collapsed east chimney and a bellows she made from 2 boards and a piece of leather. And the farmers came to her because she was good, and because she was fair, and because she handled their animals with a gentleness that made the horses stand quiet under her hands. She charged $2 a horse, which was the going rate, and she saved what she did not need, the way Adelaide and James Hargrove had saved. Slowly, without drama, the way water accumulates in a cistern. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable in the way that word is usually meant, but she was fed and warm and occupied and known, and she was building something that was hers, and the building of it was itself a kind of happiness that she had not known existed. The happiness of competence applied to purpose, of labor that leaves marks you can see and touch and stand inside of. On an evening in late May, when the light lasted until nearly 8 o'clock and the air was warm and heavy with the smell of cut grass and honeysuckle, Eliza sat in the great room of the Hargrove house, her house now, in a chair that Cyrus Bell had made for her as a gift, a simple ladder-back chair with a woven hickory bark seat that was more comfortable than any chair she had ever sat in. The fire was low in the west fireplace, just enough to take the edge off the evening chill, and the hearthstone was back in place, both pieces level now because she had packed the void beneath with rubble and mortar and made it solid. Adelaide Hargrove's letter was in the walnut box on the mantel, beside the ivory brooch, and beside Mabel Thorne's notebook, and beside her father's rasp. And these four objects sat together in a row like members of a family that had never met in life, but had found each other here, in this room, through the improbable arithmetic of loss and persistence and time. She thought about Adelaide, who had carved out a life in this valley with a husband who made beautiful things with his hands, and a son she would outlive, and a war that would take everything except the house and the land, and the hope she had buried beneath the hearthstone. She thought about Mabel Thorne, who had taught her that competence was the one thing no one could take away, and who had been right about that, as she had been right about nearly everything. She thought about her father, Thomas Kane, who had given her a rasp and told her it was the most honest tool he owned because it could only remove what was not needed, and she understood now that he had been talking about more than hooves. She thought about her mother, Catherine, who had been afraid and tired, and who had let Horace Pemberton make a decision that was not his to make. And she found that she could think about her mother without anger now, which was not the same as forgiveness, but was perhaps the road that led there. She did not think about Horace Pemberton at all. He was not worth the space he would have occupied in her mind, and she had learned, in these months of work and solitude and slow accumulation, that the mind, like a house, has a finite number of rooms, and you must choose carefully what you put in them. She looked at the fire, and she looked at the objects on the mantel, and she looked at the walls of the room, which she had replastered herself with a mixture of lime and sand and horsehair, and which were not smooth or perfect, but were solid and white and clean and hers. She listened to the sound of the creek through the open window, and the sound of Patience bleating softly in the barn she had built behind the kitchen, and the sound of the last birds settling into the orchard for the night. And she felt something she had not felt since she was a child, standing beside her father at his anvil. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do in a place that knew her name. Eliza Kane was 20 years old when she was thrown out of her family's house with $2 silver and a note pinned to her rucksack. She had no home, no family, no money beyond those 2 coins, and no plan except to walk until she found a place that would have her. She spent those $2 on a forgotten plantation in a valley she had never seen. A house with a broken roof and empty windows, and a fireplace with a cracked hearthstone that hid the savings and the hopes of a woman who had been dead for nearly a decade. It was the best $2 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and ask yourself this: what forgotten place in your own life might be waiting for someone to lift the stone and find what was buried there all along?